April 1944. Anzio. The air smelled of dust and gunpowder, the kind that settles in your hair, your clothes, and even your prayers. The walls of the small stone building shook with the distant thunder of artillery. Maria Esposito pressed herself into the corner of her room, once a servant's quarters, now her cell. In her hand, she held a small wooden crucifix. The wood was warm from her palm, slick with sweat. She whispered the same phrase she had repeated for hours. Santa Maria, proteggimi. They had been told what would happen when the Allies came. The German officers had made sure of it. In the weeks before the bombardment, the brothel was filled with pamphlets, their edges still smelling of ink and fear. The drawings were grotesque, Americans with claws, British with serpent eyes, and their laughter drawn in sharp, jagged lines. The soldiers who came for her and the others would not be men, they said. They would be animals. They will tear your skin, the pamphlet promised, because you have shared your body with Axis men. So when the first door splintered under the butt of a rifle, Maria's soul left her body for a heartbeat. The sound of boots outside was like a drumbeat, marking the end of everything she understood. She thought of her mother in Naples, who sold bread by the roadside, of her father, who had never come home from Tobruk, of how she had come here, to Anzio, after the Germans promised safety and wages. Both lies that smelled of cheap perfume and cordite. She had learned quickly what comfort meant, and now the war had turned. And the same men who once came to her bed with medals on their chests had fled into the hills, leaving her behind with the crucifix and the echo of their boots. The handle snapped. The door swung wide and light poured in. Harsh, foreign, alive with motion. Maria flinched, clutching the cross to her chest so hard she thought it might break. 3 silhouettes filled the doorway. The first was tall, wearing a helmet she didn't recognize, not the smooth gray of the Germans, but something broader, darker. The figure's outline shimmered with dust and sun. Behind him, 2 more men, their uniforms a lighter shade, khaki with wide belts, weapons held loosely, not pointed. She could smell them before she saw them clearly: oil, sweat, canvas, and something faintly sweet, like chewing gum. For a moment, no one spoke. The sound of the distant guns swallowed their silence. Then one of the men lowered his rifle, slowly, almost uncertainly. "Miss?" His accent was foreign, rough at the edges, soft in the center. An American. Maria didn't understand. She shook her head violently, whispering in Italian, her words tumbling over one another. "Non mi toccare, non mi toccare." "Don't touch me." The soldier paused. His eyes softened behind his dusty goggles. He said something to the others, a phrase she couldn't catch, and motioned for them to lower their weapons. One of them stepped back into the corridor. Maria braced herself. She waited for the cruelty she had been promised, the tearing, the laughter, the revenge. Instead, the tall soldier crouched down slowly, so his eyes were level with hers. He took off his helmet. His hair was matted, his face rough with stubble. But his voice, when he spoke again, carried no hatred. "It's okay," he said quietly, almost as if to himself. "You're safe now." She didn't believe him. The words made no sense. Safe? There was no such thing as safe anymore. Then he did something that froze her heart. Not with fear, but confusion. He set his rifle gently on the floor, leaned it against the wall, and removed his gloves. From his breast pocket he took a small canteen, opened it, and poured a trickle of water into his palm. Maria's eyes followed the water as it caught the light. She thought of baptism, of washing away sins she didn't believe could ever be forgiven. He extended his hand toward her, not to grab, but to offer. The water glistened on his palm. For the first time, Maria looked at his face. His eyes were not like the ones in the pamphlets. They were tired, sunken, human. Her body trembled. She wanted to crawl away, but her legs would not move. She wanted to shout, but her voice was gone. He didn't move closer. He just waited, hand open, as if offering not forgiveness, but a pause in the madness. When she finally reached out, her fingertips brushed the water, cool against her skin. She had prepared herself for torture. What she found instead was silence, and a kind of mercy she didn't recognize. The crucifix slipped from her hand and landed softly on the dirt floor. Outside, the sun had begun to break through the smoke. The soldier glanced at it, then at her, and said quietly to his comrade by the door, "She's just a kid." Maria didn't understand the words. But the tone, low, weary, full of pity, pierced her deeper than any bullet could. For the first time since the bombs began to fall, she felt the tremor of tears she had forbidden herself to shed. The water dried quickly on her fingers, leaving behind the faintest trace of salt. Not from the sea, but from her own skin. In that strange silence between war and peace, Maria understood nothing. Only that something had shifted. Not outside, but within. Before that moment of trembling mercy, Maria had lived inside a prison built from paper, words and pictures that wrapped her like chains. Months earlier, in the late autumn of 1943, when the Germans still controlled the coast, she had watched the officers nail posters to every wooden wall of Anzio. The messages were simple, violent, and repeated until they became truth. Gli inglesi uccideranno le vostre figlie. Gli americani vi umilieranno. The British will kill your daughters. The Americans will humiliate you. Inside the brothel, Casa di Riposo, they called it, as if rest were something you could purchase. The women whispered these things at night. They passed the leaflets like prayers, each one more grotesque than the last. One showed a British soldier forcing a woman to kneel before him. Another showed American troops laughing as they burned villages. The paper reeked of fear, printed on cheap gray pulp that left smudges of ink on their fingertips. Maria had believed it. How could she not? The Germans were her employers, her guards, her source of bread. They spoke with certainty. The Americans were monsters, they said, mongrels from far lands, born of greed and lust. To be captured by them was worse than death. So she prayed for German victory, even as she flinched at their boots, even as she washed blood from the sheets after officers came through in the night. She had been told that the war was holy, that her sacrifice was patriotic, that her service was to the Reich and the Duce. The leaflets promised salvation through obedience, damnation through surrender. But the world outside those printed lies was already cracking. By early spring, the air raids came every evening. Allied bombers, invisible above the clouds, dropped fire and thunder into the harbor. The ground shook until her crucifix rattled against the wall. Between raids, German soldiers drank and muttered of retreat. Their officers grew harsher, their tempers sharp with desperation. Maria remembered one night, February 1944, when a German sergeant came to her room with a trembling hand and a half-empty bottle. He asked her if she believed the Americans would come. She said yes. He struck her, not hard, but with the dull reflex of a man terrified of his own future. Then he wept into his hands. "The leaflets," he said in broken Italian, "they lie to you and to us." That was the first time she saw fear in a German's eyes. The kind of fear that smells of smoke and surrender. Still, she clung to what she knew. Lies are easy to live in when the truth is unthinkable. The day the shelling grew close, the day before the Americans arrived, she had gathered the propaganda sheets and burned them in the stove. The flames turned blue, then green, releasing a bitter chemical smoke that made her cough. She had done it not out of rebellion, but because she didn't want them to find the papers. She thought if the Americans saw them, they would think she had believed the words, that she had agreed. When the door finally broke, when she saw the man with the open hand and the glint of water, something inside her cracked louder than any artillery shell. It was the sound of a belief dying. She sat in that small room after they left, staring at the soot where the crucifix had fallen. Her heart still beat too fast, as if waiting for punishment that never came. She could hear the soldiers outside, calm voices, no shouting. Boots moving carefully, not stomping. A radio somewhere playing a low, crackling melody that sounded almost like a lullaby. They hadn't hurt her. They hadn't touched her. They had simply left a blanket and a tin of food on the floor. The paper lies had promised violence. Reality had brought silence. When the sun set that evening, the sky above Anzio burned red, and the air smelled of the sea, salt, oil, and hope, all mixed together. She sat by the shattered doorway and watched them through the smoke. The Americans moved like men exhausted beyond hatred. Some laughed quietly, others prayed aloud. One helped an old woman carry a bucket of water. Maria's mind rebelled. It had to be deception, some kind of trick, a way to earn trust before the cruelty began. She knew the rhythm of cruelty. It always came after kindness, always came when you believed the danger had passed. So she stayed awake all night, clutching her crucifix, watching the pale light crawl across the ceiling. Every creak of the floorboards made her flinch. Every distant shout froze her heart. But morning came, and no one came for her. Instead, a knock, gentle, a soldier's voice, the same one from before, said something she couldn't understand. Then, in halting Italian, he tried again. Cibo, per te. Food for you. He slid a small box across the floor and walked away. Maria waited 10 full minutes before daring to open it. Inside were 3 things: a piece of bread still warm from someone's hand, a tin of meat, and a square of chocolate. Wrapped around it was a torn scrap of paper, not propaganda this time, but a page from a Bible. She recognized the words, Beati I misericordiosi, perché troveranno misericordia. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. She didn't cry. Not yet. Her body had forgotten how. But her hands trembled when she touched the chocolate. The last time she had seen any was in 1942, when German officers traded it for her silence. Now it was given freely. The lies she had swallowed for a year began to taste like ashes. Maria looked at the horizon through the cracked wall, where the smoke of war met the glow of dawn. For the first time since the invasion, she thought, perhaps the world is not made of monsters and victims. Perhaps there are only the broken, trying to be human again. She picked up the bread, closed her eyes, and whispered a prayer. Not for victory, not for vengeance, but for understanding. The morning after the shelling stopped, Anzio no longer smelled like Italy. It smelled like iron and damp canvas, gun oil, smoke, and sea salt. The bells of the ruined church no longer rang, yet the town seemed to hum with an unfamiliar rhythm. The sound of foreign voices, the clang of tin cups, the rustle of tents rising where gardens once stood. Maria stepped outside for the first time since the door had splintered. Her shoes crunched on broken glass. The air bit her throat, sharp with dust and cordite. Around her, the town had become a skeleton. Balconies without railings, windows gaping like open mouths, laundry burned to threads. A painted sign still hung from one door, Casa di Riposo per Soldati Tedeschi. The letters were half burned away, Casa and Riposo, surviving like ghosts of false comfort. She wrapped herself in the thin blanket the Americans had left. It smelled faintly of soap and tobacco. Her crucifix hung from her neck now, its wood scorched where it had fallen to the floor. She held it tighter than ever, not out of faith. She wasn't sure she had any left, but because it was the last thing in the world that still felt hers. Down the street, she saw them. American soldiers moving with the unhurried caution of men who had seen too much. They were clearing debris, tending to the wounded, carrying stretchers through puddles of rubble. The war was still close. The guns thundered inland, toward the hills. But here, in the town, there was a fragile pause. One of the soldiers saw her. He froze, then lowered his weapon slightly. He called to another. They spoke quietly, not the barked orders she had learned to fear, but low tones, almost careful. The taller one, the one who had first entered her room, approached slowly. He pointed to himself. "Sam," he said, tapping his chest. Then gesturing toward her, "You?" She hesitated, then answered softly, "Maria." He smiled, a small, tired movement that barely reached his eyes. "Maria," he repeated with a thick accent, as if tasting the name to see if it would stay in his mouth. Behind him, another soldier, young, freckles beneath a layer of grime, handed her a canteen. She accepted it with both hands, bowing her head slightly. The water was clean and shockingly cold. She drank, coughed, then whispered, "Grazie." Sam nodded, then pointed to the north, to a makeshift medical tent at the end of the street. "Come," he said gently. Safe. Maria's instinct screamed to run. Every story, every warning whispered by German officers echoed in her skull. If they take you, they will never let you go. But behind Sam, she saw something that her fear couldn't explain away. A nurse, American by the look of her uniform, bandaging a child's leg. The child laughed weakly, a sound so ordinary it pierced her chest. Slowly she followed. The walk through town felt like walking through memory, each step crushing old certainties underfoot. The soldiers barely looked at her, not in disgust, not in desire, simply in exhaustion. One offered her a biscuit without a word. Another stepped aside to let her pass. No one shouted, no one struck. When they reached the tent, Sam held the flap open for her. Inside, the air was warm, heavy with the smell of iodine and sweat. A phonograph somewhere played a scratchy tune. A woman's voice singing in English, soft and far away. A nurse with gray streaks in her hair looked up. "She's not wounded?" she asked. Sam shook his head. "Scared," he said simply. The nurse nodded. "Aren't we all?" She motioned for Maria to sit on a crate. Then she brought over a basin of warm water. The sight of steam rising from it made Maria's throat tighten. She hadn't seen hot water in months. The nurse dipped a cloth into the basin, wrung it out, and offered it to her without a word. Maria stared at it as though it were a weapon. The nurse smiled faintly. "For your hands." Her Italian was poor, but her tone carried what words could not. Maria took the cloth. The warmth bit into her palms, then melted into comfort. She rubbed her fingers together, watching the gray dirt run down her wrists and into the basin. The water turned black, then brown, then gray again. She felt shame, deep, unshakable, as if the filth were not just of war, but of her own life. The nurse reached into a tin box and placed a small bar of soap beside her. It was stamped with English letters she couldn't read. The smell, faintly floral, was overwhelming in its gentleness. She wanted to cry, but tears would have made her seem ungrateful. Sam stood near the entrance, silent, watching with the kind of patience that comes from guilt. He looked at her as though he knew she wasn't an enemy, but also wasn't ready to be anything else. When she finally met his eyes, she whispered, "Why?" He tilted his head. "Why what?" "Why, kind." Her English was broken, but the meaning was clear. He didn't answer right away. He just glanced at the crucifix around her neck and said softly, "War's over for you. Let it end." Then he turned and left the tent. Maria sat in silence for a long time. The nurse refilled the basin once, then twice. Each time, the water grew cleaner. Each time, Maria's breathing steadied. Outside, the voices of soldiers rose and fell. Laughter, coughing, the creak of boots in mud. It was the sound of men who wanted to live again. When the nurse finally offered her a piece of bread and a blanket, Maria bowed her head, not out of habit, but out of something new. Gratitude. As night fell over Anzio, she lay beneath the canvas roof, listening to the wind flap against the seams. It reminded her of waves against the rocks near Naples, the sound of something endless and forgiving. For the first time since the war began, she slept without clutching her crucifix, and when she woke before dawn, the smell of coffee drifted in. Strong, unfamiliar, human. The light inside the tent was dim, filtered through olive-drab canvas stitched with patches and field repairs. Maria opened her eyes slowly, her body still caught between dream and waking. For a moment, she thought she was back in the Casa di Riposo, hearing the drunken laughter of German soldiers through thin walls. Then she smelled it again. Coffee, bitter and rich, mixed with the faint sweetness of condensed milk. The sound of voices came next, low and steady, without anger. No orders, no slaps, just life returning in cautious rhythm. She pushed herself up from the cot, wrapping the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. It was coarse, heavier than anything she'd owned, yet it carried a strange comfort. The initials US were stenciled near the edge in black ink. Each letter felt like a contradiction, symbols of those she'd been told to fear, now keeping her warm. Outside, the sun had just begun to bleed through the fog. A lantern still burned near the tent's entrance, its glass soot-streaked and glowing like a small heart, beating against the gray dawn. Maria stared at it, mesmerized. There was something sacred about that fragile light, refusing to die out amid the ruins. A voice interrupted her thoughts. English again, warm and matter-of-fact. "You awake?" It was Sam, the tall soldier from before. His helmet was off, revealing hair flattened by sweat and dust. He held 2 tin cups. One he handed to her, steam curling into the cold air between them. "Drink," he said softly. She hesitated, then accepted. The first sip burned her tongue, then filled her chest with warmth she hadn't felt in years. Coffee, strong, bitter, real. Her eyes closed as she swallowed. Sam watched her for a moment, then sat on an overturned crate nearby. He didn't speak. He just stared out toward the shattered buildings, their silhouettes half swallowed by morning mist. After a while, he said quietly, almost to himself, "You hear that?" Maria tilted her head. There was a sound beneath the wind. Faint laughter, clanking pots, a harmonica playing something slow. "No guns," he said, "just people again." She nodded, not sure if she understood the words, but understanding the meaning. He took a breath, rubbed his hands together, and looked back at her. "We found more women yesterday," he said gently. "Some hurt bad. Germans left them behind." Her body stiffened. She clutched the blanket tighter, her pulse quickening. The images that surfaced were unbearable. Women she had known. Girls who had arrived crying and left in silence. Sam saw the change in her eyes. He set his cup down and shook his head. "No one's gonna hurt you now." I promise. Promises meant nothing in war, she thought. Yet his tone, steady, almost fatherly, carried weight she couldn't dismiss. From the far side of the camp came a shout, then laughter. A group of soldiers were boiling water, trading jokes in thick accents that blended into music. Nearby, a nurse ladled soup into tin bowls. Life, messy and fragile, had returned to Anzio. Maria rose slowly, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. She wanted to thank him, but lacked the words. So she simply pressed her palms together near her chest, an instinctive gesture, half prayer, half gratitude. Sam smiled faintly. You Catholic? She nodded. My ma too, he said. She'd like you. The comment caught her off guard. For months, men had spoken to her only with hunger or cruelty. No one had ever mentioned their mother to her. The simple humanity of it, that he came from someone who prayed, who worried, broke through her defenses more than kindness ever could. He rose, adjusting his jacket. We'll move north soon. Germans still got snipers in the hills. You stay with the nurses, all right? She nodded again. He turned to leave, but paused at the tent flap. Maria, he said softly, war's gonna end someday. Don't let it end inside you too. Then he was gone, his boots crunching over gravel, his silhouette dissolving into the fog. Maria sat there for a long time. The coffee in her hands grew cold. She watched the lantern flicker as dawn brightened around it. When the nurse came by, Maria handed her the cup and asked in halting English, Help others? Help? The nurse studied her for a moment. A thin, exhausted girl in a torn dress, clutching a blanket like armor. And then nodded. Yes, she said. You can help. They spent the day tending to the wounded, not soldiers, but civilians. Women, children, old men who had survived the bombardment. Maria fetched water, tore strips of cloth, wiped fevered brows. The smell of blood and disinfectant filled her nose. Yet for the first time, it didn't feel like punishment. It felt like purpose. At dusk, as the camp prepared for night, she carried a lantern outside. The sky was painted in bruised purples and gray smoke. She set the lantern on a crate, shielding it from the wind. Its light trembled, catching on the wet stones, the faces of men and women passing by. Flickering across exhaustion and gratitude alike. She realized then that light had weight. It wasn't just brightness. It was a choice to carry something fragile into darkness and trust it would hold. That night, lying beneath the same blanket, she listened to the distant thunder of retreating guns. Her body was still, but her mind wandered far. To her mother, to her lost friends, to the strangers who had become her unlikely protectors. In the faint glow of the lantern, she whispered the first prayer that wasn't born of fear. Let me remember this light, even when it fades. Outside, a wind from the sea stirred the tent flaps, carrying with it the smell of salt and freedom. For the first time, Maria didn't close her eyes against it. The following morning arrived quietly, without alarm or panic, as if the war had paused just long enough to let the earth breathe again. The tents rustled in the wind. Field pots boiled. Soldiers stirred with the sleepy reluctance of men who no longer feared being shelled before breakfast. Maria stood alone behind the nurse's tent, facing a small wooden table where a chipped enamel basin sat half filled with water that steamed gently in the cool spring air. A square bar of soap rested beside it, wrapped in paper stamped with English letters and faint blue ink. It had a smell she did not recognize. Not perfume, not medicine. Something softer. She unwrapped the bar slowly, fingertips trembling. The edges were sharp. It had never been used. That realization alone filled her throat with something unspeakable. Because for the past year, Nothing she had touched had ever been new. For months, her hands had only known sweat, blood, and coarse linen. The idea of cleansing, not just to be clean, but to be worthy of clean, felt foreign, almost forbidden. A nurse approached quietly, her boots crunching softly in the gravel. She didn't speak. She simply nodded, dipped a bucket into a nearby can, and poured fresh water into the basin. Then she left. Maria stood there, staring at her reflection in the rippling water. A pale face, hollowed by hunger, dust smudged beneath her eyes like bruises. Her lips were cracked, her collarbone sharp. The crucifix still hung from her neck, but its wood was stained, the grain darkened from months of sweat and fear. She stepped out of her shoes and rolled up the sleeves of her tattered dress. The water steamed against the chill. Slowly, she dipped her hands into the basin. The shock of warmth made her flinch. Then, gently, reverently, she began to wash. She moved slowly, as if in prayer, rubbing the soap between her palms until it lathered. The scent bloomed with the heat. She brought the lather to her forearms, then her neck, wiping away layers of grime that had clung to her like skin. Her breath caught in her throat as gray water ran down her wrists. It wasn't just dirt she was washing away. It was months of survival, of shame, of doing what she had to do for a dry cot and stale bread. Every motion felt like confession. At one point, her knees gave slightly, and she braced herself against the table. Her hair, loose and tangled, fell into her face. She pulled it back, soaking the cloth again and pressing it to her cheeks. Her jaw trembled, her lips parted. And without meaning to, she sobbed once, low and sharp, like something had snapped. But no one came. No one shouted. No one punished her for breaking. So she let herself fall to her knees beside the basin and wept silently. Not like a victim, not like a child, but like someone returning from a place she never meant to go. Eventually, the water cooled. The soap was half worn now, its corners rounded by her hands. She wiped her face dry on a towel left for her. Clean cotton, smelling faintly of starch and sunlight. She rose slowly, not ashamed of her tears. There was something sacred in them, something she had buried under fear and routine and obedience. As she stood, she saw the nurse watching from a few feet away, not intruding, not judging, just present. When Maria caught her eye, the nurse didn't speak. She simply placed her hand over her own chest and gave the slightest nod, then turned and walked away. That night, Maria lay under the same U.S. stamped blanket. But now her skin was warm from the water. Her hair was combed back with an old American military brush someone had left near the cots. Her body, thin, bruised, exhausted, felt her own again. Across the tent, 2 other women slept uneasily. One had been found near the rail yard, her hands tied. The other was barely 16 and hadn't spoken a word since arriving. Maria had helped to dress their wounds that afternoon. She had held a cracked mirror up for one girl as she tried to braid her hair, fingers trembling. None of them spoke of what had happened before. None of them asked. It wasn't necessary. What mattered now was small and sacred. A clean face, a blanket, a name remembered without fear. Maria lay on her cot and stared at the lantern above. Its flame still lit, fluttering in the soft wind. She thought of Sam's words again. War's gonna end someday. Don't let it end inside you too. She thought of the basin, and how water could carry away the things words could never name. And for the first time in her life, she imagined a future not written in leaflets or orders, but one that began quietly, like this moment, with warm water, with the smell of soap, with no one watching but the sky. 3 days passed, not quickly, not slowly, just quietly. Time in the camp no longer moved by the rhythm of gunfire or air raid sirens. Instead, it moved with the rising and falling of the sun, the changing of guard shifts, the scrape of spoons against tin bowls. Maria began to speak again, not in full sentences, just words. Thank you. Here. Help. And sometimes, the names of the other women, said gently, as if naming them was the first act of mending what the war had tried to erase. But it was the meal that broke something open, not the first she had eaten. Those had been taken in silence, crouched against the tent wall, chewing too fast, too afraid it would be taken away. This meal came differently. It began in the late afternoon when one of the older American soldiers, Sergeant McBride, set up a crude folding table outside the aid tent. He looked like someone who had once run a hardware store, square shoulders, sun-damaged skin, thick fingers. He said nothing to Maria at first, just nodded, then began opening crates. Cans of corned beef, crackers, tinned peaches, real butter wrapped in foil. And at the bottom of the last crate, something Maria hadn't seen since she was a child, a bundle of fresh herbs, still tied with twine. That night, instead of cold rations or scraps brought in silence, the soldiers invited the women to eat with them. Maria didn't understand at first. She thought it was a mistake, a cruel joke. But when the nurse took her hand and led her forward, she saw the table had been set with real care. Tin trays lined up, enamel mugs filled with warm broth, metal utensils polished on the hems of jackets. Lanterns had been hung from tent poles. The soldiers had taken off their helmets. Some had washed, some hadn't. But all of them looked ordinary. Human. Young, mostly. A few older, with gray in their stubble and eyes that seemed to carry the whole war behind them. Maria sat between two other women. Sophia, who still winced every time someone walked behind her, and Angela, who had finally begun to smile again, if only in her sleep. They were given spoons, trays, a folded napkin, clean, soft, absurd in its elegance. And then came the stew, not Italian, not anything Maria recognized. But it was hot and heavy with flavor. Onions, meat, soft potatoes, the faint taste of pepper. It was not food meant for prisoners. It was food meant for guests. She held the spoon to her lips and hesitated. Something in her rebelled, not from fear, but from memory. She had fed German officers in the past. She had served them, watched them spill wine, tear bread, laugh with blood on their boots. Meals had always come with a price, but tonight no one asked anything of her. She tasted the stew. It was too salty. The potatoes were falling apart. But she wept anyway. No one stared. No one asked why. One of the soldiers passed down a small tin of peaches, its syrup thick and golden in the low light. Maria stared at the bright orange slices, shimmering in their metal dish like something sacred. She remembered her father bringing home peaches from the market when she was a child, back when war was just a word whispered between adults. She ate one, slowly, reverently. Sergeant McBride raised a tin mug and said something she didn't understand. A toast, maybe. The others followed, and for a moment, the camp echoed with laughter. Honest, tired laughter. No one was celebrating. No one had won anything. But for a few minutes, they had all stepped outside the war. Maria noticed one young soldier, barely a man, eating with one hand, while the other rested on a dog-eared photograph tucked into his breast pocket. She didn't ask who it was. She just nodded toward it, and he smiled. "My sister," he said softly. "Back home in Iowa." Home, that word stung more than she expected. When the meal ended, no one clapped. No one sang. The trays were cleared without fanfare. The soldiers returned to their duties. The women returned to the aid tent, but Maria stayed behind. She stood by the table, now empty but for a few crumbs and an untouched roll of bread. She reached out and picked it up, feeling its warmth. It wasn't much, but it was whole. Sam appeared beside her. He had a fresh cut above one eye, wrapped in gauze. He didn't speak right away. Then he said, "You're not afraid anymore." It wasn't a question. Maria looked at the bread, then at him. "I am," she said quietly. "But not of you." He nodded, as if he understood more than she had said. They stood in silence. Then she offered him the roll. He shook his head. "Keep it for tomorrow." But she broke it in half and handed it to him anyway. It was not a grand gesture, not a performance. It was communion, unspoken, undeserved, and entirely human. The sky above the camp darkened. Stars emerged, soft and trembling like the lanterns below. Maria returned to the tent, half a roll of bread in her pocket, and a warmth in her chest that was not from food. For the first time, she realized something powerful and terrifying. These men, these soldiers she had been told to hate, had not saved her. They had simply allowed her to begin saving herself. That night, Maria could not sleep, not from fear. That was no longer the monster at her side. What stirred in her now was something older, deeper. Shame. It came in waves as she lay beneath the blanket, staring at the canvas ceiling. The meal had warmed her stomach. The kindness of the soldiers had steadied her hands. But her heart still clenched like a fist, because kindness could not erase what she had done to survive, because no hot meal could absolve her of what she had become. In the stillness, she turned to the girl sleeping beside her, Sophia. Her breath came in small, clipped gasps, even in sleep. Her wrists bore marks that told their own story. Maria reached out, touched her arm gently, then drew back. They had never spoken of what had happened before the Americans came. None of the women did, not even in whispers. Silence was safer. Silence protected the last piece of themselves that hadn't been sold or stolen. But Maria felt that silence turning to poison in her throat. At dawn, before the camp stirred, she rose and stepped outside. The morning mist clung low over the ruined roofs. A few soldiers stood on watch, yawning into the cold, rifles resting at their sides. They didn't stop her. She carried only her crucifix, hanging like an anchor from her neck. She walked to the edge of the camp, where the field ended and the trees began, branches thin and black against the fog. There, near the broken wall of what had once been a schoolhouse, she found him, Sam. He sat alone, sipping coffee from a dented cup, staring into nothing. He looked up as she approached. "Couldn't sleep?" She shook her head. Then, in halting English, "I need talk." He nodded, moved over, patted the stone beside him. She sat. For a while, they said nothing. The quiet was not empty. It was full of everything they both carried. Maria turned to him and gripped her crucifix. Her fingers were white. "I did bad things," she said. The words fell from her lips like broken glass. Sam didn't flinch. He just waited. "I work in..." She searched for the word, her mouth dry. "Soldier's house. For Germans." His jaw didn't tighten. His eyes didn't harden. "I let them touch. I take money. Food." She looked down. "Not all time, but many time. I live. That is all." Tears stung her eyes. She had held them back for too long. "Now you help me," she whispered, "and I feel dirty." Silence. Then Sam leaned forward, set down his cup, and said in a voice so soft it was barely audible, "I shot a boy." Maria blinked. He was 17, maybe, holding a rifle, didn't raise it, just stood there. "I shot anyway." His voice didn't crack. It didn't need to. It was the steadiness that made it unbearable. I don't even remember his face, just the sound. One shot, then nothing. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something she recognized. Not guilt, but weight. The kind that stays inside your bones. "We all carry things," he said. "Some we chose, some we didn't." Maria looked at the sky, still pale with morning. A crow flew overhead, silent as ash. "I hate them," she said. "Germans. I hate them, but I miss when I didn't hate, when I didn't have to choose." Sam nodded. "Before the war." She swallowed. "I want to be clean, not just hands. Inside." He didn't speak for a long while. Then he pulled something from his pocket. A photograph, creased and faded. A young woman, dark hair, standing beside a tractor. "My sister," he said. "Used to work the fields. Said war makes ghosts of people who aren't even dead." Maria stared at the photo. Sam tucked it away. "You're not a ghost. You're still here. That means something." She didn't answer. But she felt something loosen in her chest. A knot that had been tied so long she'd forgotten it was there. Sam stood. "We're moving out in 2 days, north. You'll go with the medics, refugee transport." Maria nodded. He hesitated. "Tell them what you told me. When you're ready." She looked up. "Why?" "Because they'll need to know. And you'll need to remember that it didn't end with silence." He walked away, his boots crunching through frost-covered dirt. Maria remained seated on the stone wall. She pulled her crucifix from her neck and stared at it. Not in prayer, but reflection. It had always been just a symbol, a piece of wood. But now it felt different, not because it could save her, but because it reminded her that faith isn't about being clean. It's about choosing not to stay broken. Behind her, the camp stirred to life. Voices, mess tins, the sounds of a war-weary army pretending, for a few hours, that peace was possible. Maria stood. She breathed deep. And for the first time in 2 years, she didn't feel like she was hiding inside someone else's body. She was Maria again. No longer someone the leaflets defined. No longer someone the Germans used. No longer someone fear had shaped. She was the one who had knelt beside the basin. The one who had shared her bread. The one who had spoken the truth out loud. The nurses gave her paper. It was stiff, yellow-gray army stock, the kind used for casualty reports or rations inventories. But Maria didn't care. She had asked for it herself, standing with both hands clasped in front of her, the same way she once begged for bread. "Letter?" the Red Cross nurse had asked, tilting her head. Maria nodded. "Mama, Napoli." That night, beneath a flickering lantern and the thin crackle of distant artillery far north in the hills, she sat on a wooden crate with the paper in her lap. A pencil stub rested in her fingers, sharpened to a dull edge. For a long time, she didn't write. She just stared at the page, its blankness more terrifying than a rifle barrel. Then slowly, with a trembling hand, she began. "Cara Mama, I am alive." The pencil scratched softly as she wrote, her Italian flowing like a river returning to its old path. Her words were simple, stripped of poetry. "The war has reached us. The Germans are gone. The Americans are here. They are not like we were told. They are kind. They gave me food. They gave me warm water. They did not hurt me." Her hand paused, her mouth tightened. "I know what you have heard. I know what people say. But listen to me, Mama. The worst thing they did was not what they did. It was what they made us believe." Her eyes stung. She looked out through the tent flap, where the camp slept under a pale moon. "They made us think that mercy was a lie, that kindness was camouflage, that the world was made of monsters." She pressed her lips together, then continued, "But I have sat beside a soldier with hands rough from labor. I have eaten from the same bowl as a man who lost his brother. I have seen them bury a German boy with a cross and a prayer, even after what he did. She stared at those words for a long time. They are not saints. But they are not the devils we were promised. A breath, then another line. Mama, I want to come home when it ends. But if I cannot, know that I am no longer afraid. I am no longer ashamed to say I lived. I did what I had to do. But I did not let it become all I am. She signed her name, slowly, as if she were reclaiming it from the mouth of war. Maria Esposito. She folded the letter, held it against her chest, and wept. Not from grief, but from the soft ache of having something left to say. The next morning, she gave the envelope to the nurse, who promised to pass it along the next time the convoy connected with Allied command. You're brave, the nurse whispered. Maria shook her head. No, just tired of silence. That afternoon, the Americans invited the women to a gathering. Not a celebration. Nothing in war felt like a celebration, but a quiet thing. A chaplain in a wrinkled uniform set up a makeshift altar using an old ammunition crate and a white sheet. Maria stood at the back with the others. The soldiers sang in low, uncertain voices. The chaplain spoke of forgiveness, of burden, of the strange road between suffering and hope. He read from a small English Bible with corners softened by use. She understood none of his words, but she watched the men, hardened faces bowed, lips moving, and knew they were searching for something, just like her. Behind her, one of the girls whispered, "My brother died in Sicily. Maybe these men fought him."